Okay, this mid-tower case is roughly at least 43 liters, depending on how you measure it. And this other guy here, well, you're familiar with this one, right? 18 liters. We're going to compare the thermal performance and see which one finishes out on top. Welcome to Machines and More. Alright, so this is a project that I've always wanted to do, and that is compare the performance of an ATX mid-tower case to a mini-itx, in this case SFF one, for a mid-range Ryzen 5 level air-cooled gaming build. Of course, there are also some other considerations that I'll discuss for each one as well, but we're just going to take a general look at these two cases here. It's important to note that this test isn't necessarily meant to say one is better than the other, but just to highlight the differences and present the relevant information for this type of use case and component choice. And I think this will be helpful if you're debating such a choice, or if you're just curious. On the left, we have the TD500 V2. This is a recent revision of Cooler Master's popular mid-tower, and we're going to compare it to a case you're familiar with, Cooler Master's NR200, and this case is the Caribbean Blue one. So big thanks to Cooler Master for making this project possible. They sent over the cases, the cooler, and the power supply for us to check out on this project, and both of these are really great cases in their own right, so I'm really eager to see the results from this comparison. So I'm going to test the two with the exact same motherboard, exact same CPU and cooler, and the graphics cards. The fan speeds will keep identical, but one area that we will have a slight difference here is that the TD500 V2 comes with 320mm fans at the front. We'll use those as is, they're pre-installed already. And the NR200, it comes with two sickle flow fans. Those are installed for use at the top, and we'll just add on two case fans at the bottom. And the noise levels at the lower RPMs we'll be running these fans at will result in more or less a negligible noise difference. So parts for the CPU, we're going with the 7600X. For a current gen gaming build, this is a great choice, in addition to the 7600. I did want to test this in a way that mirrors how users will probably run their systems in real life. So instead of locking down the voltage and the clock speed like I usually do for comparing SFF cases, these will be running on PBO. I'm not going to do a curve optimizer offset or manually limit the PPT either. We'll just make sure that these setups that they run at similar power levels and clock speeds. The higher power that the chip will run at this way will give us a little bit more resolution out of this test, and we'll also get an idea of the boost clocks the chip will boost to on stock PBO. To run the Ryzen 7000 chip, we'll need a motherboard. It does have to fit in the NR200, so we do have the MSI B650 mini-itx board. It does, look a little funny in the mid-tower, but it definitely fits. We'll cool the CPU with Cooler Master's Hyper 212 Halo. This is a basic cooler, but it is sufficient to cool the 7600X. Typically comes with the Halo fan, which from my experience, it is more of a case fan. So I'm going to swap out for the Mobius 120p ARGB White Edition, which was also released recently, and I'm keen to check out this one since it's more of a performance fan that still has that RGB, the ARGB for those that want that look. And it's similar to the 120p Mobius in black that we looked at previously. I was waiting to do this test here with the latest gen graphics card, so that'll be the RTX 4070 Founders Edition card here, which we reviewed in the last video. And the power supply I'm using here is super overkill for this setup. It's a 1100 watt Platinum SFX power supply from Cooler Master, PCIe 5.0 compatibility with a true 12V HPWR cable. If you're running this at 220 volts, you can actually squeeze 1300 watts out of it, but hey, the system won't draw more than 450 watts, so I think we have plenty of overhead here, which absolutely doesn't hurt. Okay, so I'm going to be building in the TD500 first, and then we'll take a quick look at the build experience, the performance, and the features. Okay, all done here. It's a really nice case, actually super easy to build in and fully featured. I don't build in mid-tower cases very often, but one thing I really appreciate about a lot of mid-towers, including this one, compared to SFF cases, is a dedicated cable management section. And This one especially helps clean things up. You've got the fan hub in there and an RGB hub, so very nice for cable management. Using an SFX power supply in a case of this size isn't usually something I'd recommend. Not that it won't work, but it's, the stock cable lengths are going to be stretched if the cable lengths are optimized for an SFF system. The 12V HPWR cable does reach, but it is stretched to the max here. I really like this textured mesh front panel here. It adds quite a bit of intrigue when viewed from the front, and the little details on the side tempered glass also adds to that intrigue as well. So aesthetically, really balanced case. For the airflow setup, the front case fans are set up to intake from the front, and that's how I'm running them at 900 RPM, and that also means that the general airflow direction is going to be exhausting out the top and also the rear. So I have the cooler fan set up to exhaust out the back. This way it's streamlined within that general airflow direction. Typically with a flow-through GPU, like this Founders Edition card and an SFF case, this can be a bad setup, but when you have this much airflow coming through the front, plus the 4070, it's not exactly 3080 or 4080 level of board power. So mostly it's mitigated, and it's a non-issue. That flow-through section, it's not going to have an adverse impact on the CPU cooling here. When testing the CPU by itself for a Blender render, the cooler is barely sufficient. I have this cooler fan at 2000 RPM, which is not max yet, so there's still some headroom. The 7600X finished the render at about 102 watts of package power given to the CPU, and it's boosting to 5.2 gigahertz at this point. It's not thermally throttling, it's below 95 degrees, so in general, a cooler like this one, it'll work just fine for the 7600X. It mounts directly to the AM5 base plate without any spacers or anything. I was a little doubtful whether the mounting pressure was sufficient, but certainly this seems in line with expectations for a 4-heat pipe cooler equipped with a single fan. Looking at a gaming scenario, I'll just show you a result from AOE 4 at 1440. Typically your GPU will be at full load and your CPU will see less than full utilization with many modern titles. Single core max frequency that I observed on the 7600X was 5.45 gigahertz, so we aren't getting the expected single core boosts. Package power with this title at 1440 averages around 45 watts. These temps are perfectly fine, and the GPU is running here with the fans locked to 30% or 1400 RPM. Even at that point, the temps and power consumption are very manageable. It's a quiet card, and I really like this one for gaming in a small form factor system. So with that, we'll switch the contents over to the NR200, and we'll take a look at how that one works out. Building in this case is something I'm familiar with. Blue paint is actually really neat. It's the first time I'm seeing the special color version here, and I really like it. It's like a white NR200 with accent panels, and this makes for a nice contrast. I just migrated the components directly on the motherboard. A quick and dirty cable management here, nothing too fancy. The one thing you really do have to be careful with these recent NVIDIA Founders Edition cards is to cinch up the cables tight under the power supply, and that way they don't get caught up in the flow-through fan from the cooler. As for the airflow setup, there aren't any front fans on this case, so we don't want to funnel the flow-through exhaust directly through the CPU cooler. So I did move the fan over to the back to intake air through the rear of the case. And at the bottom, I had two of the Mobius ARGB fans handy from Cooler Master. These are just the black version of the cooler fan. So how does it work? Well, let's take a look at the vented panel first here. For the CPU only render, the smaller NR200, it runs the 7600X a tiny bit warmer with this setup. And one of the downsides of testing CPU thermals on PBO is that you can get varying results from run to run because of the boost algorithm. The goal here is just to get a general idea, and as long as the differences are small, not a big deal. The high level inferences will be similar. For gaming, a lot less of a difference between the ATX and ITX cases. The CPU temp is practically the same. You're still getting the same 5.45 gigahertz single core boosts here. Package power given to the chip was identical. The card temp is a little bit better on the TD500. And I double checked the core clocks on the GPU. They were also within 10 megahertz of each other. So you're basically getting the same level of performance here. The TD500 does have a glass side panel, so perhaps we should also test with the glass panel. The NR200P's glass panel fits with this tower cooler, so let's just throw that test into the mix. For the CPU-only render, you do have a slightly higher temp versus the vented panel. We do expect that, given that the ventilated side panel is where some of the CPU cooler's exhaust would exit from, but it's actually not a big difference here. And just a footnote, we're still seeing more or less the same boost frequency as the other tests at around 5.2 gigahertz. For gaming, the CPU temp comes in a little bit higher, and not because of the CPU itself, since as we saw in the CPU only test, the difference, it's not this big, right? And mainly it's from the glass panel creating a more insulated environment for the tower cooler that it's sitting in it. And when the GPU is running, that's going to warm things up inside the case. Because we have case fans at the bottom, creating a more direct airflow path for the GPU cooler's intake, the glass panel actually doesn't have a significant impact on the GPU temps here, and in fact, it's a tiny bit better. This is my first time comparing two cases like this clinically, and while I didn't expect the NR200 to beat out a good mid-tower like this, in fact, I'm a little surprised that they are so close, because if you look at the results overall, the mid-tower comes out on top across most metrics, but not vastly so. In general, the performance that you can expect with this type of setup in both cases will be practically the same. And that just goes to show that the focus and directed airflow that can be achieved in an SFF case like this goes a long way to offsetting the smaller volume of air inside the case. This is a high-performing mid-tower, and this is a high-performing SFF case. So when you set up both properly, performance really shouldn't be the differentiating factor here for your choice. For the mid-tower, for a first-time builder, it's going to be a little bit easier to work in. The cable management is a bit simpler. You have way more boards to choose from, which is a biggie for a Ryzen 7000. And if you want, you can add on more fans at the top and back, although for this kind of setup, it's totally in the realm of diminishing returns. Of course, that space can also be utilized for a 360mm rad in the future if you need additional cooling. Of course, the NR200 is no slouch either, because you can take put a 280 in there as well, so that's still very comparable. Not a big concern for most gaming builds, but you can also have more storage options in the mid-tower if you need. And the front panel I/O is more fully featured for the TD500. You do need to have the room to display a case this big though, and if you do, that's great, but if you are limited in that regard, the NR200 is easy on space. It's great for a desktop, and the build process is still very much beginner friendly. The key panels can all come off for easy access to building, and you still have plenty of options to grow with if your component needs or your cooling desires grow more expansive, and you're not really missing out on performance by going SFF here, so less might be more here. So I hope you enjoyed the duel between these two cases and found the information helpful. If so, please give a like, subscribe if you haven't already. I'll leave the component links down below. Thanks for watching today.